Lagos never truly sleeps. It only changes the kind of struggle it wears. In the early hours of the morning, when the air is still heavy and the streets are yet to scream with movement, there are people who wake not because they have rested, but because life refuses to wait for them. Ajara was one of those people. Before the first rooster crowed, before the first bus conductor shouted for passengers, before the first pot of food began to boil in the neighborhood, Ajara was already awake. Not because she wanted to be, but because she had no choice. Her life was not measured in comfort or time. It was measured in responsibility. 6 children. 6 lives that depended on her breath, her strength, her sacrifice. And a husband who existed more as a shadow than as a support. The house they lived in was not really a house. It was survival squeezed into walls that had seen too much. A single room, a small parlor, and too many dreams struggling to fit inside. The walls were thin, but the burdens were heavy. At night, the children slept close to each other on worn-out mats. Their bodies curled in ways that tried to make space where there was none. Hunger often followed them into sleep, and sometimes woke up with them. But Ajara rarely slept. Even when her body lay still, her mind refused to rest. It wandered through worries, calculations, silent prayers that had no guarantee of answers. She would sit in the darkness, listening to the uneven breathing of her children, counting them again and again in her heart, as if confirming they were still there, because losing even one was not something she believed she could survive. Morning always came too quickly, and with it, the reality she could never escape. The firewood would crack as she struggled to bring flame to life, smoke rising stubbornly into her face, stinging her eyes, forcing tears that had nothing to do with emotion. But she never stopped. She could not stop, because stopping meant hunger, and hunger meant weakness, and weakness was something her children could not afford. Every meal she prepared was a miracle of stretching nothing into something, a handful of ingredients becoming food for many mouths, a pot that never seemed full enough, yet somehow always emptied. She learned how to lie gently, not with words, but with hope, telling her children that tomorrow would be better, even when tomorrow looked exactly like today. And in the middle of all this, there was Rakim, her husband, a man who once had the chance to stand beside her, but chose instead to drift away. While Ajara carried life, Rakim escaped it. The streets knew him, the bars welcomed him, alcohol became his language, his comfort, his excuse. And every night, the story repeated itself. Someone would come knocking, not with help, but with information. They had seen him again, somewhere, lying, lost, disconnected from the world that still depended on him. And Ajara would go. No matter how tired she was, no matter how heavy her body felt, no matter how much her spirit begged for rest, she would go. Through dark streets, through unfamiliar corners, through places where dignity quietly disappears. She would search for him. And when she found him, she would carry him. Not just his body, but the weight of what he had become. Sometimes people watched, sometimes they whispered, sometimes they laughed, but Ajara never responded, because shame had already become something she lived with. Bringing him home was not the end. It was only another beginning, because inside that same house, she faced a different kind of pain. There were nights when she was no longer a wife, but a stranger in her own life. Nights when she stepped aside, not by choice, but by force of circumstance and silence. The floor became her resting place, hard, cold, unforgiving, and yet she endured. Not because she accepted it, but because she had something bigger than herself to protect. Her children. They watched, they learned, not through teaching, but through survival. Childhood did not last long for them. It slowly slipped away, replaced by responsibility. After school, there was no rest. The streets called them too. Small hands carrying trays, voices calling out to strangers, feet running between moving vehicles. Danger became normal. Fear became familiar, because survival does not wait for age. And then, one day, everything almost changed forever. A moment, a sound, a sudden stop that no one could reverse. One of them fell. The street that fed them almost took them, and in that moment, reality stood still. No money. No hospital certainty. only panic and helplessness, and a mother whose strength was being tested beyond its limits. But even in that darkness, Ajara did not break. She bent, but she did not break, because breaking was not an option she believed she had. Time moved on, slowly, painfully, but it moved. The children grew, not just in age, but in understanding. They carried the memory of every sacrifice, every struggle, every silent tear their mother never allowed them to see. Education became their escape, their way out, their answer to a life that tried to define them by hardship. And somehow, against all odds, they made it. They crossed the line that poverty had drawn for them. They stepped into a different world, one their mother had only imagined. And for a moment, it seemed like everything Ajara had endured had meaning, that her suffering had produced something beautiful. But life has a way of testing even the strongest victories, because not all success remembers where it came from, and not all hearts remain the same. Ajara, who had given everything, slowly became someone who no longer fit into the lives she helped build. Her sacrifices became stories, not realities people wanted to carry. And then, the final blow came, not from poverty, not from struggle, but from rejection, the kind that cuts deeper than hunger ever could. And somewhere along the line, between smoke-filled mornings and sleepless nights, between lifting a man who never stood for her, and raising children who needed everything from her, Ajara lost something she could never get back. Herself. Even her sight slowly faded into darkness, not suddenly, but gradually, like a light that had been overused, and finally gave up. And still, even in darkness, she thought of her children first, because that was all she had ever known. To give, to endure, to disappear, so others could live. But in the end, when the noise of survival quieted, and the world moved on, Ajara was left with something she never prepared for. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes when a life of sacrifice is no longer remembered. And in that silence, her story remained, not written in books, not spoken in crowds, but carried quietly, in the truth of what it means to give everything, and still lose everything. Time does not stop for pain. It stretches it, reshapes it, and then quietly asks if you are ready for more. Ajara never had the luxury of answering. The day began like every other, heavy, uncertain, already tired before it had fully started. The streets outside were alive again, voices calling, engines roaring. Survival, repeating itself. And like always, her children stepped into it. Small feet walking pads that should have belonged to grown men. Small hands carrying responsibilities that should have waited years. The world saw them as just another group of children hustling through traffic. But Ajara saw everything. Every risk. Every passing vehicle. Every moment that could go wrong. She carried fear the same way she carried hope. Quietly, deeply, constantly. And then, the moment came. Not announced, not expected. Just sudden, a sound that did not belong. A shift in the air, a stillness that followed chaos. Something had happened, the kind of moment every parent fears, but prays never to meet. One of her children had fallen into the unforgiving hands of the street. Time slowed. The world did not. People gathered, voices rose, confusion filled the space. But for Ajara, everything became silent. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the poverty, not the hunger, not even the shame she had carried for years. Only one thing mattered: survival. But survival cost something. And this time, it demanded what she did not have: money. The one thing that had always stood between her family and safety. Doors that should have opened, remained closed. Help that should have come, stayed distant. And once again, Ajara was left standing between her child and the uncertainty of life itself. She did what she had always done. She endured. She fought, without noise, without recognition, without guarantee. Because giving up was never part of her language. Days turned into nights, nights turned into waiting, and waiting turned into something heavier than exhaustion. But slowly, life returned. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough to continue. And for Ajara, continuing was everything. Because stopping meant losing. But something changed that day. Not outside. Inside. A crack, small at first, but deep enough to grow. The weight she had carried for years began to press differently. Her body started to speak in ways she could no longer ignore. The long hours by the fire, the smoke she had breathed without rest, the strain she had pushed aside, began to return, not as pain alone, but as warning. Her eyes, the same eyes that had watched over 6 lives, but survival cost something. And this time, it demanded what she did not have. Money, the one thing that had always stood between her family and safety. Doors that should have opened remained closed. Help that should have come stayed distant. And once again, Ajara was left standing between her child and the uncertainty of life itself. She did what she had always done. She endured. She fought, without noise, without recognition, without guarantee. Because giving up was never part of her language. Days turned into nights, nights turned into waiting, and waiting turned into something heavier than exhaustion. But slowly, life returned. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough to continue. And for Ajara, continuing was everything. Because stopping meant losing. But something changed that day. Not outside. Inside. A crack, small at first, but deep enough to grow. The weight she had carried for years began to press differently. Her body started to speak in ways she could no longer ignore. The long hours by the fire, the smoke she had breathed without rest, the strain she had pushed aside, began to return, not as pain alone, but as warning. Her eyes, the same eyes that had watched over 6 lives, the same eyes that had stayed open through sleepless nights, began to weaken. At first, it was small. A blur, a moment of strain, a pause to refocus. But life did not slow down for her to notice. So she ignored it, like she had ignored everything else about herself. Because in her world, her needs were always last. Days passed, then weeks. And slowly, the light she depended on began to fade. Not suddenly, but quietly. Like something leaving without saying goodbye. Still, she continued, cooking, cleaning, providing, memorizing her environment, learning to move without fully seeing, adjusting without admitting that something was wrong. Because if she stopped, everything else would stop with her, and she could not allow that. The children noticed, not immediately, but gradually, the hesitation in her steps, the way she turned her head slightly, trying to catch what her eyes could no longer hold, the way she moved, not with certainty, but with memory. But even then, she said nothing, because mothers like Ajara do not easily admit weakness. They carry it, hide it, become it, until it becomes something they cannot escape. And by the time the truth became clear, it was already too late. The darkness had come, not completely at once, but enough to change everything. The world she had fought to protect became something she could no longer see. And yet, she still tried to hold it together. But this time, the roles began to shift. The children she had raised began to rise. Not just in age, but in strength. They stepped forward, into the space she had held for so long. They became her eyes, her support, her continuation. And for the first time, Ajara allowed herself to lean, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The years of sacrifice had finally taken something she could not fight back from. But even in that darkness, there was something she held on to. Pride. Not the loud kind, but the quiet knowing that despite everything, her children had survived. They had grown. They had become something more than the life that tried to limit them. And for a moment, it felt like enough. Like maybe, just maybe, all the pain had meaning. But life does not always end where we expect it to soften. Time moved forward, as it always does, not waiting, not asking, not caring who was left behind. The children grew into the future Ajara had fought for. The same streets that once watched them struggle, now watched them rise. School uniforms turned into office clothes. Barefoot journeys turned into purposeful steps. Hunger turned into stability. Everything changed. Everything, except the past, because the past does not disappear. It waits. Quietly, patiently, until it is remembered or ignored. And in this story, it was ignored. Ajara no longer saw the world the way she once did. Not because she didn't want to, but because the world had slowly taken that from her. The years of smoke, the endless strain, the life she lived without pause, had finally collected their price. Darkness became her constant, but even in darkness, she carried light for others. She listened. She remembered voices, footsteps, presence. That was how she understood the world now, not through sight, but through memory. At first, the children stayed close. They cared. They tried. They reminded themselves of everything she had done, and for a moment, it felt like the story was turning, like sacrifice had found its reward. But life has a way of introducing new influences, new voices, new perspectives, new priorities. And slowly, the balance shifted. The eldest son, the one who had seen the most, the one who had carried the deepest understanding, built a life of his own, a new home, a new family, a new beginning. And with it came a new voice. A voice that did not know Ajara's past, and did not carry her pain. A voice that saw inconvenience where there should have been gratitude. Ajara became something unfamiliar, not a foundation, not a sacrifice, not a story of strength, but a burden, something that did not fit into a polished life, something that reminded people of where they came from, when all they wanted was to forget. The house that should have welcomed her slowly closed around her, not with noise, but with distance, cold, quiet, distance. And then, it happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would stay with her forever. She was no longer needed. His wife said, "Mama cannot live with us." All the years of waking early, of sleeping late, of giving more than she had, were suddenly not enough to secure a place. The woman who built survival for others now searched for space in the lives she created. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. Not anger, not bitterness, but something deeper, a quiet breaking, the kind that makes no sound, but changes everything. She began to speak, not to defend herself, but to remember. She remembered the firewood, the smoke that filled her lungs, and slowly took her sight. The nights she stayed awake, while her children slept, the hunger she hid, so they could feel full. The streets she walked, searching for a man who never searched for her. The floor she slept on, in a house that should have been hers. She remembered everything. But memory is not always enough to change the present, because the people she was speaking to were no longer the children she raised. They were something else now, something shaped by comfort, by distance, by forgetting. And slowly, reality settled in. Ajara had given everything, and now she had nothing left to give. Not strength, not sight, not even a place to belong. The man who once filled her life with pain had also fallen. Rakim, who had run from responsibility, now ran out of options. Age caught him. Poverty held him, and the world he ignored him back. He became smaller, quieter, almost invisible, just like the woman he once took for granted. And in the end, they both faced the same truth. A life lived without balance always collects its debt. Ajara's ending did not come with noise. It did not come with recognition. It did not come with celebration. It came the same way she lived, quietly, slowly, almost unnoticed. The world continued. The streets remained busy. Life moved forward. But somewhere, in a space filled with memories and silence, a woman who gave everything faded away. Not because she was weak, but because she was human. And even the strongest hearts have limits. What is the true price of a mother's sacrifice? If you were one of Ajara's children, what would you have done differently? Is it right to have more children than you can properly care for? Should a woman endure everything just to keep a family together? Do you think Ajara made a mistake by sacrificing everything for her children? After everything Ajara did, do you think she deserved how her life ended? Please drop your views in the comment section.